All right. Good evening, everyone. Once again, it is I, Matt Yancik, your host with Roleplayer with 1,000 Faces, and I'm back with one more face on the long list that I'm slowly but surely working through. But as you know, I like to tease upcoming events and other things going on the channel before we get to the meat of tonight's episode. I just wanted to say that actually recently we've been getting a lot of new subscribers, and while for maybe some of the huge, gigantic channels, the amount that we've been getting is minuscule, for me, particularly, it is a lot. So to all of you out there that have been liking, subscribing, and sharing, I do very much appreciate you tuning in. It makes me feel good to know that people enjoy the programs and enjoy the stuff that I'm creating. As many of you know, and I've reminded everyone, I'm really not in this for the money, the fame, or the glory. Trust me, there's not very much of that in it. I'm more in it for selfish reasons. I am a teacher. I am also a storyteller, and I'm a human being that really loves talking to other human beings about things that we have in common and even things that we have that are differences. So to all of you that have been tuning in and watching, thank you so much. And to those of you that haven't subscribed, why have you not subscribed? Why are you watching right now? Please hit that subscribe button, but even better, if you could, please tell a friend or share an episode that you may enjoy. Sharing is a wonderful way to help the channel grow. I have a funny feeling that a lot of you have been kind of doing that anyway, and to those of you that have, thank you very much. If you're interested in one of the things I was telling the people in the chat earlier tonight is that I'm not very good at juggling the chat, the streaming software, the interview itself, and making my guests feel comfortable. So I'm not always able to sort of respond in the chat, and for that I apologize. But if you are interested in following us and talking maybe to me, you can always check us out on Discord, Facebook, and Twitter. Discord, in particular, has been growing. We have a lot of creators in there. We have a lot of viewers in there, and we have just basically a lot of cool people in there. People I've been playing with at Gen Con Online and things like that. We have games going. Actually, we have a game that's going to run on Wednesday, I believe it is. One of my good game mastering buddies, Steve Canaris, one of the two other game masters that I've ever allowed to game master here on the channel, the other being DM Scotty McFarlane, the craft master. He's going to be running a game on Wednesday, so please do check that out. And lastly, as far as previews of upcoming events goes, I am going to be having a guest in a couple of weeks who will basically fill a neglected hole in the channel that I have had for a while now. So one area and aspect of role-playing that I have not really covered very much about, and it's actually I haven't covered any of it, and I think it's really unfair, is cosplay and LARPing and things like that. So in a couple of weeks, I'm actually going to have Harley Kane on. Harley Kane, she is a performer, a model, a cosplayer, and a tabletop role-playing game enthusiast. So I'm actually really excited, like I said, to sort of fill this vacuum that I've had on the channel. I think I guess maybe because I'm an English teacher, I often think about all the narrative aspects and all of the things that are going on in your mind and the things that you're imagining. But then there are those people out there that are actually creating stuff, building costumes, acting out what they are sort of experiencing in their minds. So I'm super excited to have Harley on the channel on August 29th. I believe that's a Monday, so please do tune in for that. But, okay, enough with the spiel. Thank you all very much for coming. Who I want to introduce tonight, someone who I've been following on Twitter for maybe 6 or 9 months now. His threads, if you've read them, are really fascinating, and they have very much scratched an educator itch that I've had with role-playing games over many, many years. So the gentleman that's coming on tonight is Stefan Huddleston, and I first sort of bumped into him virtually, reading one of his Twitter threads, which I instantly it was like yin and yang. I was like, oh my goodness, the things that this person is saying, I think are wonderful. This is the sort of person I want to talk to. And I was delighted to find out that not only is he a very wise tweeter, if that's what that's called, tweeter, but he's also an amazing educator who has written a paper from a scholar's point of view on early role-playing game development. And I just want to make sure I get the title right. It is When Worlds Collaborate, the Style of Early Tabletop Role-Playing Games. And I sort of, on the down low, I like to check all my guests out and make sure they're legit. I sort of ask them, can I read your paper? I read it, and it was 40-something pages, chock full of scholarly goodness on role-playing games, and I knew I had to have him on the program. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Stefan Huddleston onto the program. Stefan, I'm so sorry to make you sit through all of that. You've been very kind and patient. How are you tonight?
Well, I'm doing great, and thank you for that introduction. That was, I'm doing wonderful.
I'm glad to hear that. It's really not a problem at all. Thank you so much for coming on. As I said, your paper and of course many of the threads on your Twitter page have really scratched an academic itch, and it's been an absolute delight to read through your thoughts and ideas and your perspectives on role playing and on history and elements of culture and society. So as I mentioned, Stefan is a teacher, and I believe a university lecturer. Is that technically the term?
Mm-hmm. That's adjunct professor, university lecturer, they both apply. So yeah.
Got it. Can you tell us, Stefan, before we get into kind of like the nitty gritty of what you've written about and what you've done, why are you a teacher, and what is it that you teach?
So I back in 2013, I was laid off. I had spent the previous 13 years, the previous 25 years doing a wide assortment of jobs, but I had landed in the last 13 years from, as we moved into the year 2000, from 2000 until 2013, I was in the fire protection industry, and I got laid off in 2013, just as, and in that time frame, my wife had gone back and gotten her bachelor's degree. And so we kind of swapped places, we traded places, and she went into the workforce and I went back to school to pursue and ended up pursuing my graduate degree in history with a minor in film. And I have always loved history, and I said, I'm going to go back to school and do what I love this time. I'm not going to be as focused on the money, and I was fortunate enough to be in a position to be able to do that. And so it sort of just naturally led into teaching for me. And so I teach primarily histories of marginalized groups. I focus on gender aspects. I focus on some LBGT Q issues. I focus on some on people of color, indigenous, and just marginalized groups as a whole throughout history. And then I also focus on, so I do mostly American history, but I also do sub-Saharan African history.
Oh, wow.
I do pop culture history. In pop culture, and dabble a little bit in South Asia, kind of like India, Pakistan, a little bit there. But then also, like I said, pop culture history, film, and then of course role-playing games through that. And then I did a little bit of work with Arthurian myth
Oh, wow.
as that relates to things. So one of the three papers that I wrote for the master's program, one of them was a myth about two kind of overlooked 13th century tales that deal with Black African knights in
cool.
Arthurian legend. Yeah, so those are kind of, it's kind of an eclectic mix, but they're all kind of put together by these themes of marginalized groups that are kind of my focus. So
if we kind of rewound and went back a little bit, what do you think it was that maybe led you on the path to sort of like link these various interests together through this kind of lens of marginalized groups? Like if we look at young little Stefan who's running around and he's being a young kid and all of that stuff, was there something that influenced you when you were younger that you think like kind of got stuck in your head
Yeah, 100%. I think so. I don't think I realized it at the time, of course. But growing up, I'll gladly date myself. I was born in 1970. I discovered role-playing games in 1977, shortly after this movie, this little like out-of-the-way production called Star Wars had come out.
It's an independent film, wasn't it?
Yeah,
made on a shoestring budget.
I'm sure a few people have heard of it.
Yeah.
But obviously, in 1977, Star Wars was a phenomenon. It shook the world. It certainly shook my world.
Yeah.
And so for me, I discovered role-playing games shortly thereafter, and I started playing role-playing games. And I dove right into Dungeons and Dragons. That was the first game I picked up, and it was me and one friend. And I just kind of was making stuff up as I was going along. I just started, I'm going to, do this. And I had no idea what I was doing. I just made it up. And so, somehow these things called lightsabers ended up in my game, and blasters ended up in my game, and all these things, and whatever, I was just having fun. And then I moved from there into other games, other role-playing games. And I've played so many games in the 70s and 80s. And then I always loved television and film. So there's all of these shows that were influential for me. And I never realized it at the time. It was something that dawned on me later. I had a few flashes, but it never dawned on me at the time that all of these movies I was watching, all of these things that I had seen at the time, all of my heroes were white. None of them looked like me. And they all fit kind of the same mold. The Gil Gerards from Buck Rogers and the Richard Hatches from Battlestar Galactica and the Han Solos. They fit the same mold. Yeah. And it's odd, and it's one of the things that I kind of point out when I'm teaching kind of things related to film and pop culture, is that there's sometimes it's the little out of the way, really small budget films that have these impactful moments that Hollywood wouldn't dare do. And so there's this really cheesy 1980s film, 1982, I think I want to say, called Megaforce. It's a really super cheesy movie. It's one of the few movies that has, I think, a 0 on Rotten Tomatoes. But I was 12. I didn't care. We didn't care. It's got like flying motorcycles with rockets on them. And to a 12-year-old, it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But there's a moment in the beginning of that film where one of the characters in the movie it's of course supposed to be this eclectic group of multinational like heroes that work to stop dangers all over the world. And one of the characters is black, and in the opening sequence he runs into the kind of this snooty kind of traditional British pip pip cheerio style general. When the general comes upon him, he's listening to, he's got his headphones in. And the general looks at him and he says, Gladys Knight and the Pips. And he says, no, Vivaldi. And then shortly thereafter, he quotes Shakespeare. And of course, when I was running around and I grew up, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. And I grew up in my early years, it was kind of in South LA and things like that. But as I got older, we moved out into more kind of suburban, greater Los Angeles area. And, like when I went to third and fourth grade, and for a while after that, I was one of 3 black kids at my school. And so when I was out playing with the other kids, guess who got to be the black guy? I was always B.A. Baracus. I was always Lando Calrissian.
Right.
So this movie, we had all gone to go see it as kids, of course. It was the first time I got to quote Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It was the first time I got to say, be the smart one in the sophisticated one, right? And so I didn't realize at the time, but looking back, those were the things that kind of influenced me into writing this. Was I was like looking back and going, oh wow, I didn't play a character in role-playing games who looked like me until the 90s.
Interesting. Yeah, I had read that, I thought, in your paper, and I kind of wanted to talk about that. You brought up a lot of really interesting stuff that I kind of want to talk about more in depth. It reminds me a little bit of some thought experiments I've done for myself when I'm trying to sort of figure out like how the world is oriented. So I don't know if you noticed, but I'm white. And you may have noticed that. But there are times when I try to think about, like I reverse roles. There's something that Michael Crichton said, and I'm not saying Michael Crichton is necessarily a great writer or a great philosopher or whatever, but he said sometimes when you reverse roles and you do things from an opposite viewpoint, it can shed some light on what's really going on. And I believe he was trying to defend a book he wrote called Disclosure, and it was a book in which he reversed the typical sexual harassment lawsuit in which it was a man that is being sexually harassed by a woman. And I'll often do like little experiments in my head, and I'll think, well, how would I feel? And I think a lot of white people don't really think about this, but like I go to a movie and I think, well, wait a minute, everybody in this film except for 2 or 3 people is white. What would happen if I reversed all the colors and I made everybody the opposite? How would I feel? Then how would I feel if every single movie, or most of the movies that I go to see, are all that way? And then I think, okay, I'm going to change it on another axis. I'm going to change it. What if all the males and females suddenly reversed? And the people doing, like the Bruce Willis running around is Demi Moore or whatever. And like the supporting role, the Holly McClane is Bruce Willis, who's, at the end wearing a coat over his shoulders and soothed by Demi Moore or something like that. And it makes me think all the time of like some of the things that you sort of mentioned. So I guess this is a very long and roundabout way of getting to what you were just mentioning about how you're saying that you role played white characters or not black characters until the 90s. What was it that kind of, I mean, it was that moment of the Shakespeare in the film and the listening to Vivaldi and all that. Was that what kind of awoke your senses at a certain point, or your?
It was kind of like this kind of touchstone moment, but I didn't really like fully conceptualize it at 12. But now I can look back on it and go, oh my gosh, that was kind of a light bulb moment. And the wheel started to turn a little bit. So like, when I was in, when I played games, again, I played white characters because those were the heroes that I saw in all the media. All the big heroes were like, they were the top guys. If the black characters were the sidekicks, right? You look at something like the A-Team, which is a classic, right? The 3 white guys are officers. BA is the only non-com, right? That's kind of like a staple throughout things, throughout media. Like they're the sidekick, they're the villain, they're all these other things. And so I, was just kind of acculturated into this idea that the white guys were heroes. Now, and I freely admit, man, in the 80s, it was a different time. And man, I did some stuff back then that I would never do today. I played some awful character stereotypes of some Asian characters and some indigenous characters and things like that, because that's what I saw reflected on television and media, right? And then I think it was in the 90s, I really started to gather this awareness that, I kind of started to look a little bit more at the world around me and started to ask some of these questions about like, is this right? And it was really, I think, when I started to get into kind of the World of Darkness games, and some of those had some very stereotypical portrayals.
Yeah.
And one of the things with the old World of Darkness games, I think, is that a lot of people played the characters, and one of the things I say a lot about role-playing games is that as soon as you write something down, there's going to be a subset of people, and sometimes a large subset, who are going to take whatever you write down as like canonical law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people were running around in White Wolf games and they played the characters exactly as the stereotypes presented them. Rather than, to me, it was like, man, the stereotypes are there for us to shatter. The stereotypes are there to defy. So I always played characters that went against the stereotypes of whatever the clans or the tribes said in the book. And that led me down some roads where I started to like kind of question some things. And then, obviously there are some portrayals of particularly indigenous Americans, things like that in the old White Wolf games that would never fly as easily today without lots of commentary and feedback, and rightfully so.
Can I ask a question about that? So let me ask this, like, from teacher to teacher. Do you think that making those mistakes is part of the growth process?
Absolutely.
The realization, or I'm of course not, like, from an idealistic teacher standpoint, everybody realizes and everybody self-reflects. But in general, would you say that it's actually for you or for me or for other people that play a stereotype or come to shatter it, suddenly realize you've been playing a stereotype and then shatter that and turn it upside down, it's kind of a healthy experience to at least self-reflect and then sort of be reborn out of it, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think, obviously we all have moments in our lives where we kind of can reflect our privilege, right? Or our acculturation into the culture that we're brought up in, and not realize that these things are like a kind of a skewed vision. And I think going through that and going, oh, wait a minute, and can be a healthy experience so long as you have that self-reflection. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely.
So then let me ask this, just to slightly shift gears here, but I'm kind of to get into the RPG stuff. When you were playing, were you running mostly, or were you a player, or are you like a forever
both.
GM now, or both?
Both. Yeah, I do both. I've been fortunate enough myself. I've been really lucky, I would say, in comparison to a lot of other people I've encountered, in that throughout my lifetime, I have been a part of groups that have multiple people willing to run games and a wide array of games. And so, even now, the people that I play with, there are 4 or 5 of us who will rotate off, running things and things like that. So I've been fortunate for pretty much all of my time to be, a player and a GM. Even when I was in high school, we would do these things where we would like, okay, everybody, we're going to make D&D characters, and we would run these long extended campaigns where like 3 or 4 of us would pass the baton and our characters would shift to become NPCs, and we would like run like a kind of a subset of a story and run those characters through things, and then we'd rotate. And that's been pretty consistent throughout. So I've been fortunate to do both.
Are you playing with a lot of, like, I've actually recently been playing with some, because of the pandemic, one of the kind of cool things that came out of it, at least from a very small standpoint, is that I've been able to reconnect through Zoom to a lot of my high school friends and the players that I played with. Are you playing with anybody, like, have you been playing with who are you playing with? I guess maybe I should just phrase it that way. Who are you playing with?
Yeah. So of course my spouse, she plays as well. We met actually LARPing.
Oh, cool.
Back in 94, 93, for crying out loud. 92, gosh, yeah, it's 92 we met. Good graves. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
And then we have some other friends that we've known for a little over a decade who we've been playing with. And they both have played for not as long as I have, but for quite a long time. And then, and then another couple that we met through it was actually through a Critical Role kind of fan group here in town. We met them, and now we play with them. And then also my brother and sister-in-law as well.
If you were stranded on a desert island and you could only play or GM, I don't know if that makes sense, but would you play or GM? Which one would you rather be doing?
Gosh, I love both so much, and I love interchanging. But like, if I really had to pick one, probably GMing.
I knew, as a fellow teacher, I knew you were going to say that. We all like to sort of control our little classroom and keep the kids from getting out of hand.
I love the creative process. I love creating worlds. I love creating places and things and new vistas and all of that. That's what attracted me to role-playing games in the first place. When I first came across it, I'm like, what is this? You mean I can make these worlds myself? I'd never looked back after that. That was just like all of those times that I read, and I was fortunate. My mother was adamant. She had me reading by the time I was 2.
Oh, wow.
She and she instilled in me a lifelong passion for fantasy and science fiction. And so I read, about that same time I started role playing was when I read Lord of the Rings and all of this other stuff. And so all of those times I read books or watched a movie and I was like, man, I wish they'd have done this. And I was like, now I can do
right. That. Yeah, right. Like, that's actually, I was talking to someone about this, and they were saying, like, and maybe as someone that was very interested in studying, film and television and very much into that, you can kind of relate to this. But the idea of, you go watch a movie on a Friday night or Saturday night or whatever, you get to make your movie and like direct it or act in it or produce it or whatever you want to call it, or as often as you really want. So there's so much like fun in that. So what was it then that sort of prompted you? So I get the interest, and I kind of see what you have in your background there. What was it that prompted you then to sort of cross a line there and go from looking at games from obviously I think as a history teacher or as someone interested in history just in general, and interested in like storytelling and all of that, you would probably want to get a little bit deeper. But what was it that made you cross that line into, I'm going to write a paper, I'm going to write a thesis, I'm going to write an article about this?
Yeah. So I was fortunate, again, I think when I was in high school, which were kind of like really my most formative years, I think a little bit of middle school, but definitely in high school, I really got together with a kind of a group of guys that where we played so many different games. And we played, I mean, all day Saturday and sometimes Sunday, and summer would come around and it was just gaming all summer long. And I was fortunate, I think, in that the group that I played with, we had a couple of the guys were Filipino, and one of the guys was Egyptian, and I had a fairly reasonably diverse group. The majority of them were white, but there was some diversity there. But whenever we would go to the game store, whenever we would go to conventions, it was one of those moments in my life, the other being going to concerts of like heavy metal bands and things like that. You go to Metallica concerts and cons where we play this game called, Count the Brown People. And it's like, count how many people of color there are here who aren't staff at the hotel where the con is being held.
Yeah.
And I would rarely get over 5. It was just a sea of white. And so when I was finishing up my program, and the course that I was taking was really on what historians refer to as the long 60s, which is kind of this period from about roughly 1955 through 1979-ish, depending on who, which historian you're talking to, because you can't just condense everything that happened in the 60s into just this kind of like 10-year period, right? And so, and I'm like, that's when role-playing games came around, and why was that happening? And so that started clicking in my head, and I also said, well, I know what my experiences were, and I've heard a lot of anecdotal things about other people's experiences.
Yeah.
But what can I go dig and find out about on a scholastic level, digging in and doing some research, what was actually going on in role-playing? And that's kind of what led me down that rabbit hole.
It's an interesting reflection, and for those of you that haven't read the paper, it's interesting. So you look at I guess the 3 kind of pillars here of it are race, gender, and you mentioned the Vietnam War or the conflict at that time, and to see those reflections or you know, the repercussions or the ramifications, or you know, just like the ripples in the water that you see through the games themselves. It's really fascinating to read, and it's an interesting read. What's surprising though, and it's a recurring theme through your, or not a theme, I should say, it's something that you mentioned a few times in the paper, is that lack of academic focus on tabletop role-playing games, and the way that you even mentioned a few times how they're sometimes dismissed as just part of the evolutionary path to video role-playing games. Why do you think, like, and I agree, as a fellow teacher, like, often looking for material on games, and someone who likes to use games in the classroom and help use them as learning tools, why do you think there's such a shortage? Why aren't people writing more things about tabletop games?
I think there's been a shift. There has been a nice shift recently into where we started to see a lot more. It's still fairly limited, but we started to see a lot more that's happening. But it's really kind of heavily contained to a few things. There's a couple of online journals. The analog game journal, and then the International Journal of Role Playing out of Europe, where we are seeing some scholastic stuff. There's a couple of books of compilations, and there's a few other people on Twitter, Dr. Emily Friedman, Aaron Trammell, Evan Troner, who are all scholars who I reference, many of them in my paper, who are working in role-playing games. And of course, we go all the way back to the very beginning. There was kind of this weird kind of thing. Role-playing games emerged, and then a sociologist by the name of Gary Allen Fine does the first ever ethnography in the late 70s. He embeds himself into some role-playing clubs and makes observations on these role-playing clubs, and then writes a book in the early 80s called Shared Fantasy. And then after that, it's kind of dead for a really long time. People aren't looking at role-playing games scholastically, right? Of course, then we go through the Satanic Panic and all of that thing. And people aren't really looking at them a great deal until really the early 2000s that people start to return back to role-playing games and start to kind of give them this serious thing. They just were kind of, I think, for a very long time, kind of dismissed as too niche, even though they have this massive influence on, I mean, the genre of computer role-playing games is massive. And they all originate from tabletop role-playing games. I think they were just so dismissed for a very long time, but starting to change. And I wanted to, I saw an opportunity to kind of like put my voice into that emerging conversation on role-playing games. There's, like I said, a handful of, and we have two different things going on, as we always do, is we have kind of what we have are popular books that are written by people who aren't necessarily scholars. They are just people who are some of them are very good, but they're just not necessarily trained scholars. But they're writing about role-playing games, and then we have like kind of the scholastic actual handful of articles and books that are coming out from scholars that are kind of intermingling now, which is, like I said, it happens in all disciplines. You get kind of the popular histories and then the academic histories of things. And I think there's a place for both.
Well, it's really interesting because recently, yeah, you are right. Like, I think that there's a wealth of information about there by kind of well-meaning people that don't necessarily have the have the academic background, who take them very seriously, and it kind of makes some sense, right? So if you're like a fan of role-playing games or of anything in particular, you probably take it more seriously than other groups might, and so you will see those people who would take a closer look at whatever it is and try to dive in. There was a very interesting one where they were talking. I feel bad now because I've forgotten the gentleman's name. I actually contacted him because I wanted to talk to him. There's a gentleman that wrote a gamer's perspective on the QAnon phenomena, and I think you probably know what I'm talking about. It was really fascinating, but again, it was from what I was so interested in was just the fact that even though he wasn't necessarily an academic, there was so much on the Venn diagram that crossed over between like game design and say like the idea of like a cultural movement or this belief in a mass fantasy or this crossing the line, all of that stuff. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
Can you tell, and this kind of ties into that, can you tell us a little bit about what the idea of, what is the concept of gaming capital, and why is it, why might it sort of reflect this maybe barrier to sort of overcome to getting more scholarly looks at RPGs?
Yes. So, capital kind of in any thing, whether we talk social capital or whatever, or in this case, gaming capital, is kind of like a collection of knowledge that some have and others don't, right? And if you have this knowledge, it gives you certain advantages. So gaming capital, if I were to kind of walk in and kind of like slump down in my chair and tell you, oh man, I'm feeling a little low on stamina, or my hit points are running low, right? You are gonna know what I'm talking about, right? But someone who's outside, who's never played a role-playing game of any kind, be it computer or whatever, isn't gonna know. And then it gets even more dense when you talk specifically into role-playing games, when you get into specific settings, you get into specific terminology that may be, something like hit points is pretty general throughout role-playing games, right? Mm-hmm. But you might get into some terms that might be very specific to one role-playing game and certain terminology. And so gaming capital is, having that knowledge to obviously differing levels, just like with, social capital or actual physical, like in the Marxian sense, capital, there's a difference between a millionaire and a billionaire, right? So how much knowledge you may have is this concept of gaming capital, and then that allows you a certain amount of leeway to discuss things with people. So, like for instance, when I wrote my my paper, I had to write it because I knew I was going to have to present it to people, other academics, many of whom knew nothing about role-playing games.
Right.
So there were some very basic things that I put in the paper that probably anyone who reads them who's a gamer is going to be, yeah, I know all this. I know what a GM is and all of these other things. But I was having to present this to people who didn't know, right? In an academic setting, because they didn't have any gaming capital whatsoever.
I know without asking your grade and whether you pen and all that stuff. Well, how was the reception to it? Like, did you get people scratching your head? Were you presenting it to a group and they were kind of like asking you to revise this, revise that, or I need clarity on this or that, or how was the reception to it?
I had one thesis advisor.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did in my program. In a lot of programs, you write one large thesis. In the program that I was in, they had us write 3 smaller theses.
Mm-hmm.
And each one you would do a research section and then you would do a writing section with the same kind of advisor. And they would give you things. But at the end of that, then you had to present that to kind of a larger group of not only your peers, but other professors. And kind of present your main points and your main ideas. And then they could pepper you with questions and things like that. About it, and the reception. I mean, I guess I could toot my own horn and say it was the outstanding thesis.
Nice.
For that semester. So
that's excellent, and I think as a fellow teacher, I encourage all of you to, when you self-reflect, even though of course you're looking at things you want to improve, but don't ever be afraid to praise yourself on the stuff that you do right. Like, it's really important to do that. And now maybe like just because, and what I'm probably going to do now is I'm going to ask you for help on definitions of a few terms, because I think they're going to help us as we sort of swim through your paper and sort of talk a little bit about what it is and what you do with it. The next term I kind of wanted to ask about was bricolage and how it pertains to your paper, and maybe this one in particular. Can you tell us a little bit about what that concept is and how it helped you write?
Yeah, 100%. So in the term bricolage comes from the book Subculture and the Meaning of Style, which was a 1979 book by Dick Hebdige, a scholar named Dick Hebdige. And what he was doing was he was looking at subcultures of the 1970s. Particularly, he was looking at like punk culture in the UK. And he uses this term bricolage, and he uses this term to reference. Yeah, he uses this term to reference the things that make up a style. And in the way he's deploying the word, he's deploying it so that if you saw someone who was walking down the street in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And they're wearing a mohawk and a Vandals t-shirt, most people are probably pretty much going to know punk, right?
Right.
And just as we move into the 80s, long hair, somebody's wearing jeans and Vans and, a Rat or a Dio t-shirt, heavy metal, right? So the bricolage is kind of the things, and it could be other things like tattoos and things like that. A large part of it is what we refer to or what they refer to on the sociology side as sartorial codes, what people wear. But it can also be how they speak, the slang that goes along with it, and all of these things that kind of mix together to form a particular style. And so in my paper, I was kind of taking that and another concept from another scholar by the name of Eric Zoloff in the book Refried Elvis, where he was looking at rock and roll in Mexico, and particularly in Mexico City, but throughout Mexico. And he uses this term called a shared repertoire. And I took these two concepts together and kind of put them together to say that in the formation of a particular style, the style for those who were playing role-playing games in the early years, between 1974 when D&D comes out and roughly about 1985, that the style isn't something that's reflected in the what they're wearing. It's reflected in the speech a little bit, some of that capital that we were just talking about. And more so, it's reflected in the worlds that people create and recreate, right? That we take these ideas and we may take a module and we may run that module wholesale, but then we may insert our own things into it, because the players may all of a sudden say, oh, hey, I want to go over here. And we start to create our own world. And that leads to a greater sense of creation, in that I also use this concept from Stuart Mill, where he talks about reception theory, right? And reception theory talks about someone encodes something, they write it, and we decode it, right? But more so than even something like, say, fan fiction or things like that, role players are constantly re-encoding, because we are constantly playing through things or running things, right? And so we're constantly altering these worlds we play in, right? And we don't only do that at our own table, but maybe we share those ideas with other people, even more so now. But even back then, we had methods that people were sharing these ideas with each other. The internet makes it so simple now, but even then people were sharing ideas where they say, hey, I ran this game and I did this and I added this monster in and I did this. Oh, and I did this modification to these characters. And these ideas spread throughout the community now with like great alacrity, but even then to some degree. And so the style that Brcolage was the worlds that were being created by the creators, and in the terminology that rises up around those worlds and what we were doing. And that the worlds became the reflection of what I call the TTRPG style, rather than some outward appearance the way it was now. We may see that a little bit more today in cosplay, where we may take on some of the traits of these worlds that we're creating even more so. But at the time, of course, in those early years, that wasn't quite as common yet. In those early years. So
interesting. So it's, and I just want to sort of make sure I understand you. It's kind of like, and I'm going to use some very non-academic terms. It's like taking like a hodgepodge of different elements, sort of bringing them together, and then like sort of reflecting them maybe internally versus, you're saying, like externally. And then the idea of, I like you talk about, encoding and decoding and then recoding and like going through this cycle, because I guess you're right. Like, and on the simplest, like in the simplest ways, that's essentially what we're all sort of doing every week when we're playing these games, is we're taking like Monty Cook or, or Gary Gygax or whoever has created this material for us. But honestly, we're not using, as far as I know, most people are not using it perfectly within canon. They're like tweaking it this way and that.
To some degree, like everyone makes those modifications, I think, at some point, right? Even if it's just you playing a character, right? Obviously the people who wrote that module can't dictate or imagine everything that people are going to do when they're playing a character, right?
And so last term here, I kind of wanted to talk about, and I think my French co-teachers, I teach at a private French school, and they're all going to be laughing at it because we're using some French terms tonight, and I'm getting them all wrong. I'm the American guy whose French isn't so great. Folie à deux. What is folie à deux, and how does that pertain to role playing? This was an interesting idea, I thought, as well. I think you're pretty close. I think it's folie à deux.
But I'm not. My mother knows French, but not me. So in the book Shared Fantasy that Gary Allen Fine wrote, when he was doing this ethnography and he was looking at studying these groups, the term itself refers to either a shared psychosis or a shared set of similar mental disorders affecting two or more people. Usually the members of a close family is kind of like the book definition, right? But he basically referenced role playing as kind of a benign form of a shared delusion. Essentially a shared dream, or as he terms his book, a shared fantasy that we were kind of taking together as a group to enter into this kind of shared fictional space where we were all going to participate in shaping a story. And so, yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, this, again, I kind of, again, relate it in the most basic term, a shared dream.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've from what I understand, and of course this is all just from memory, and I obviously have not studied this, but I've talked with a few people that have kind of looked at shared fictions and storytelling, and from what I understand, when you're kind of creating something together, or when you're watching something on television, or when you're reading something in a book, even though there's some slight there things are being like decoded in different ways, and you're looking at it in different ways, the things that are happening in your brain are very, very similar to what would be happening, assuming you're into it, very similar to what would be happening were you actually experiencing them. So in a
Sure.
weird sort of way, what's interesting is that when people, and I think I might have said this a couple of weeks ago on the show, but like when people are sitting at a bar talking about what happened to them in their game a couple weeks ago, they're actually sort of reliving things in a very similar way as they would be reliving something that actually happened to them, like with like tactile, like something that happened to them in real life, and all of that. So it's interesting to hear about that. Can you tell us then? I know that the kind of finally here, before we sort of move on to the things that you've looked at very specifically, you did something that that apparently a lot of people have not done, and that was you actually looked at the tabletop RPG books themselves and sort of focused on them in a way. What was it? What was it that gave you the idea to look at the books, and what sort of insights do you think they helped helped you sort of excavate?
Yeah. I think a lot of times, people think about the concept of primary and secondary sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for, those out there who aren't, or may not remember, or don't know, the primary source is something that comes typically from the time that you're dealing with, right? And a secondary source is something that's written later, where someone's going back, maybe taking some primary sources and kind of analyzing a set of events and kind of compiling a particular argument, right? And I think a lot of people, but those can shift, right? And one example I use to my students is that if we were to take a textbook is typically a secondary source. But if I were to go back and look at a textbook from the 1920s and say, hey, let's look and see how many African-American authors there were in this textbook. Let's see how many female authors there were in this textbook. Let's see in this textbook how many things are mentioned about African Americans, or how many things are mentioned about Asian Americans. Now it becomes a primary source, because we're looking at the way that was structured in that time, right? And what was going on in that time when that textbook was written. And that's what I kind of set out to do with role-playing books, because no one, to my knowledge, had really done that, looked at the books themselves. So I said, I'm going to pull some of the games of the time period, particularly Tecumel, the Empire of the Petal Throne. I'm going to look at Tunnels and Trolls. I'm going to look at Dungeons and Dragons, Traveler. And then I said, well, I'm going to look at Dragon Magazine. I'm going to look at about the first 10 years, roughly, of Dragon Magazine, because this is kind of the main stock and trade. And I wanted to see, as to kind of align with my thesis, how do these publications deal with women? How do they deal with people of color, in particular, in that framework? And so that's kind of what led me in that road to kind of focus on the games themselves and on Dragon Magazine as like primary sources. How are they treating these particular aspects in that time frame?
It's a really interesting idea, because when you think about it, I feel like it's actually, hearing you talk about it, it sounds like such an obvious thing. Like we basically have a slice of certain time periods and eras. If you go back, and we have 5 or maybe 6, depending on how you count them, editions of like D&D itself.
Right.
So if you actually stack them all up and you took a look at maybe the way that certain rules are presented, or the ways that certain, the way the book is structured, how they, the pronouns, all kinds of things. Like there's even just the illustrations themselves. It seems so obvious that it makes me think, my goodness, why weren't people kind of taking a look at this before?
Right.
Like a rich sort of like, it's like a Rosetta Stone through which you can kind of like decode like each era, I guess.
Absolutely.
So then the 3 primary things that you were focused on then were race, gender, and to a certain extent, like the reflection of the times in, say, the Vietnam War and whatnot. Can you give us like a brief overview of why you chose those 3 and what you felt or what you sort of got out of that?
So the through thread there is that the long 60s in general are this time of great social upheaval, right? And so the locus that I'm looking at on those 3 things, when I'm looking at race, gender, and the Vietnam War, I'm looking at these particular points of social upheaval, so major significant social change that would have been influencing the people who were writing these games and writing these articles at that time, whether they necessarily knew it or not, right? The overwhelming majority of the people who are playing role-playing games at the time, and we really have to kind of pull from some various things, because it's not like there were a great many surveys that were conducted, but observational data from what Gary Allen Fine was doing, there's like a survey, but it's only a survey of maybe like 1,000 people in Space Gamer that they put out. Data that I'm pulling from other areas and things like that from other sources pretty much confirms everything that can be found because no one was collecting hard data. Pretty much everything that can be found says that overwhelmingly the people who were writing and playing role-playing in these teams are white middle-class men. I'm going to assume, based on the times, the overwhelming majority are heterosexual, and a great many are Christian in them, or at least come from kind of a Christian background, if not necessarily practicing Christians. Based on some of the things they say and do that you pull from some of the pushback you get, or the things they say about some of these other marginalized groups. And so in this time frame, they are looking out at a world that is changing, a world that is challenging in a lot of big ways, with the civil rights movement and the second wave feminism and the push for the ERA and the Vietnam War. All of these things are on the minds of people all across America, even the people who are writing these games, right? And so I'm looking at these 3 points of great social change and upheaval that, even if they weren't directly on the minds, they were in the back of the minds in these individuals. And I argue in the paper that those were influencing how they were writing these games. And you could even find a few points of pushback in the Dungeon Master's Guide, for instance. Gary Gygax just flatly comes out and says, that he eschews terms like gentle people and gentle beings, because the masculine construction is the way we've always, essentially, to paraphrase, the way we've always done it, and he sees no reason to change that. And so you have to kind of strip away and look at it's very rare that someone is going to come out and say, hey, I'm a victim of structural institutionalized racism or misogyny or any of these things, right? You have to kind of go in and pull apart what they're saying and dissect their words, and then construct an argument around that, right? There's very rarely we call it in historical circuits the magic bullet, right? Where somebody's going to write down in a piece of paper, hey guys, guess what? I'm a racist, right? or I'm a, or I'm going to do this thing that's Oh,
my goodness.
That was my puppy.
Well, it wouldn't.
Yeah,
Let
that
me
was
tell
my
you
puppy
something.
who
It wouldn't
decided
be
to
an
nap.
episode of Roleplayer with 1,000 Faces or a stream without the presence of a cat, a dog, or otherwise another pet.
Other animal. Yeah,
Yeah.
she. But yeah, so so you have to construct an argument around like what are these people saying? What are they doing? Right. So this is why I'm looking at like statements like that one from Gygax and statements from some of the other early game creators. I'm looking at things like, for the first 5 editions of Tunnels and Trolls, we have a spell called Yasa Masa
Yeah. Yeah. I was very
that
shocked and
enslaves the target, right?
yeah.
Enslaves the target. We have to look at those things, and certainly there's arguments to be made that some of these things are off-color jokes, but whether or not they're off-color jokes, right? They fit into this kind of schematic of institutionalized racism and things like that. And then the same thing with what's going on the gender side of things,
Mm-hmm.
and and then looking at again one of the big things that I looked at in Dragon Magazine and in the games themselves was the art. Who's reflected in these games?
Mm-hmm.
How are they reflected in these games? And so overwhelmingly, white European characters. And when you see characters from other parts of the world that are representatives of Asians, it's very kind of orientalized in the sense of, for those who haven't read Edward Said's Orientalism, a book I highly recommend. It's very orientalized in this sense of fetishizing the West. So it's samurai in armor, or someone wearing robes with the kind of traditional kind of like Fu Manchu mustache.
Yeah.
And then characters of color are going to be wearing leopard skins and holding a spear, or they are presented when we're talking about like D&D in these kind of very Africanized, again. I would argue it's still kind of the same tropes of Orientalism, just applied to Africa in this very fetishized way of the way you see. And that kind of is a running thread throughout the art. The only exceptions that I note there are exceptions. Most of them are a section in Dragon Magazine where they take characters from the Marvel Comics for the Marvel Comics role-playing game, and they're translating those characters into game stats.
Yeah.
And so characters like Falcon or Luke Cage or things like that. But if it's any other like original art or anything, it very much through and through these games, it conforms to, those characters like that. And then all the female characters, of course, they're nude or half nude or the chainmail bikini, right?
Can I ask you a question? And I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself right now, but you sort of brought it up here, and it was an interesting comment, I thought, in your paper. And maybe I misunderstood what you were writing, but it seemed to me, so later on in the paper, you do get into the idea that the fans are also actually creating a lot of stuff, and that's part of like the whole like back and forth between what's canon and then how the thing evolves and how it changes over time. You were, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you were saying that a lot of the holes that you saw in these games were being filled by fans who would create a Luke Cage character for Marvel superheroes or the Falcon or whatever. What were those primarily being like? Who were the authors of those, if you know at all? Were those black men that didn't feel represented at the time, or do you think that was a hodgepodge of different creators, white men that just said, "Oh, well, you haven't done Falcon yet, so let's do Falcon"? Or do you know anything? Did you discover anything?
A lot of them were particularly white creators who did things. Very few. We do see a few interjections in Dragon Magazine by authors I know who were black, who added a few things into Dragon Magazine, or authors who were Hispanic, or who were from the Latin community. In other aspects, there were a few others who crossed over from other things. I do certainly know that very early on there were a handful of women like Lee Gold and a few others who were very instrumental in the formation of D&D. Lee Gold writes like articles right in the beginning. she's like in the first, like, I don't know what, issue 3, issue 2 of Dragon magazine, and she writes several other articles, and then she curates alarms and alarms and excursions, which is kind of one of the offshoots of what was known as APAL, or the Amateur Press Association Los Angeles. So what you have in this time frame, and pre-internet era, what you would have were these things called amateur press associations, and they started out kind of as fanzines for a lot of science fiction and fantasy things, where what people would do is they would write things and then they would send them into a curator. Curator would compile all of these things that people wrote. Sometimes it would just be a quick blurb, like a question that someone would put out, or it would be maybe a little bit of fan fiction or something like that. And then those would get sent out to all the members of this APA, right? And there are different ones all across the country. And APAL at one point becomes so dominated with Dungeons and Dragons content that they asked, they're like, hey, can you start your own? Because you're just like overwhelming us. It's all D&D stuff.
Yeah.
So Lee Gold starts Alarms and Excursions, and it does the same thing, but with D&D content. And so there's people like all over who are writing these things that are coming together in things. But then there are also a key handful of women who are very early on writing articles in Dragon magazine, and writing things that end up in the first couple editions of D&D. If I'm remembering correctly, I want to say the Iron Golem was created by one of these women. There's a few other of these like iconic monsters and things like that that are created by some of these early these women who are early players and early GMs of the game.
Why do you think it is? Because it sounds like, just from listening and hearing this, why do you think it is that it's almost like women are the ones sort of starting to establish a little bit of a foothold, if you want to call it that, or sort of entering in, and we didn't see black or Hispanic or people of color in general at the very beginning? Is there something maybe going on?
I think there was so a couple of things I think happened there. I mean, certainly we had some early people who really shaped, I think, the game, like Mike Pondsmith, Castle Falkenstein and Cyberpunk and stuff like that. But it was a little bit more under the radar, I think, because like even early on, like initially I picked up someone like Pondsmith and stuff, and I didn't realize he was black at first. And then when I found out, I was like, oh, holy cow! This guy writes like one of my favorite role-playing games of all time, and he's black. I like about flipped out because I love Cyberpunk. So I think they were there. I think they were just a little bit more hidden, kind of in the mix of things, and people just kind of naturally assumed they were white because that was just kind of what was overwhelmingly there. And certainly we had a few other writers who were of Asian descent and of Hispanic descent, but who were certainly present. And I think with women, they were just kind of pushing back and defying some of the few early women. Gygax was really, really weird. He knew that these women existed. He got their articles for Dragon magazine. He was well aware, but he still kind of dismissed them as anomalies. And at one point he even says, someone at one point asked him, like, what would the women libbers think about some of the things in D&D? And he says, I'll worry about that when women start playing D&D.
Yeah, I think you actually mentioned that in the article. If you had to speculate, why do you think that was going on? Why do you think he would have said something like that? Was he just like one of those kind of bullish, boastful kind of? What do you think is going on with that?
Like many people, like a great many people throughout history, it's very easy to go in and this is one of the things where history as a discipline, where historians, like a lot of people, like to play at history. But one of the things that, we're going through in learning history as a discipline as historians is that people aren't always truthful when they write things down, even to themselves. Just because they write a letter or they write a journal doesn't mean they're not lying to themselves. And so we're looking at like not only what they say, but what they do, their actions, the multiple things they say, what other people say about them. And we try and come to kind of an ideal. and Gygax, from everything that I compiled on him and things like that, he's a traditionalist, right? And I think a great many of these early creators were, and I think the worlds that they created, and this is part of one of the key arguments of my paper, is that the worlds that they created, right, were pushbacks against what was changing in the world to them, right? They are, their world of where they are in charge, right? Even if they're not necessarily in a position of power, right? They are kind of on the top of the chain, and now they're seeing a world where things are changing in the there's the puppies again. There's a change in the in what's shifting with again, the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and second wave feminism, and all of these things are changing their world. And one of the big arguments I'm making is that the worlds they created, the fictional worlds they created, were to bring things back to a time where they were the top dogs.
They had
We're going to look back at this. Yeah, and they had full control when you're talking about role-playing games, right?
Yeah.
They had complete and utter control. And so they were able to go back to a time where, even though they're not right, and they make mistakes that we'll talk about till the end of time, whether we're talking about the existence of studded leather or we're talking about all of these other errors in actual history, right? They are formulating their ideas based on primarily on the fiction that they're reading. And then they're also basing it on some early 20th century history, written primarily by white men, right? That kind of erases women and voices of color from history. And so they're writing based on these fantasy tales where women aren't doing a whole lot and people of color really don't exist. They're writing based on these histories of, what do you mean there were black people in there were no black people in Europe at that time? Well, yeah, there were. And if like, you can take a couple of authors in the 13th century who are writing about black African knights coming to Africa, and they're European writing about this, and they can write fiction about it, then, it's kind of hard for you to convince me that they're, and we certainly have plenty of other evidence of people of color existing in Europe. It's not like they were common, but they were most certainly there.
Right.
And so, but they were basing it on kind of these romanticized versions of a very kind of chivalrous Europe. And this is where we get these core worlds of Greyhawk and the others that we know, and Blackmore and all these other things from the early days. These worlds that are built around this kind of fantasized ideal of an idealized, chivalrous white Europe. And then all of the stories that they're basing these things on, Tolkien and Howard, kind of center on that, and they center on those ideas, and they center on these ideas of all of these other places where people of color exist are foreign and exotic and again, orientalized.
It's very interesting. There's a couple things I kind of wanted to touch on with that. So one is, and this is the shorter one, so I'll start with this one. I'm actually prepping to run a Conan game using Modiphius's new system, the game.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, I'm really into. I played the 2D20 version of Dune, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. And they translated it over. System. Yeah, it's really cool. It was it was surprisingly fast and easy to pick up. Like at first I was a little intimidated by it, but my players loved it, and I ran. Here's just a little ad, but I ran an actual play, a 2-part actual play. If you go check the playlist, you can check it out. Where
awesome.
I ran it, and I was so nervous because I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to screw this up. But there was something about the system that was actually quite. It was easy somehow, and maybe it was because I panicked, and for like 3 days I studied the rules. But I really loved it. So I'm prepping this Conan game, and because of that. And I'm thinking it's going to be a 3-parter. I'm actually giving homework assignments to some people playing in it. I'm saying, okay, I want you to read this story, that story, and the other story. And I'm reading some of the work, and it's just a little touchy. It's not a little touchy. It's a lot touchy. Like, I love his writing style. It's got so much vigor, and it's such a wonderful writing style. But I've never
Absolutely.
felt more aware of like how terms like black or dark or hairy and actually I'm very hairy. I've
Yeah,
never been
yeah.
more aware of how problematic obviously they are, and
Yes.
I'm sort of going through it and I'm trying to not sanitize it, but I'm trying to balance it so that it's a fair
Yeah.
representation, and I kind of like look at it through a lens of 2022. So it's just interesting that you mentioned those works, and like I
Yes.
thought it was kind of like me, and like literally like today I was reading one of the stories, and actually I was kind of shocked too, by like I'm reading some of the
Yeah.
comics and stuff, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it even made it into the comics. I thought the comics
Yes.
wouldn't be like that, and I don't remember them because I was just a little kid when I read stuff like this, but
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh my goodness. That was my first point,
Yeah.
but my second point was the idea that I found very fascinating, and it reminded me of another idea, and you probably know this from your film background and studies background.
Yeah.
The idea that you mentioned how the Vietnam War kind of took away sort of a partial sense of control of your environment, and so
Yes.
I think a lot of people talk about how Star Wars came along in '77. It was very simple. It was very easy to follow who the good guys and bad guys were, and whether
Yes.
or not it was representative, that's maybe a slightly different issue. But at least as
Yeah. Yeah.
far as it's the language it tried to use to tell its story cinematically and narratively, it was very simple and easy to follow. And that comes on the heels of the Vietnam War as well, and it's
Yes.
just a huge, obviously, probably one of the biggest films of all time.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot also of the Godzilla films and how. So I lived in Japan for about 7 years, and it's so interesting having that shift in perspectives. And there are a million things I could talk about, but the one I think I can express here on the program to a lot of people that maybe haven't been to Japan or whatever is the idea of it's no coincidence that the Godzilla films come after the atomic bombs are dropped,
Absolutely.
not far after, and the fear of this creature that is created and uncontrollable, and it's from like atomic explosions at the bottom of the ocean, and it wreaks havoc and destroys cities. It's interesting how that reflects what's going on, and I don't know if they were. I'm sure there were studies
Mm-hmm.
that have been done, and we could find out, or I could find out, but I don't know if people knew it at the time. But looking back and reflecting, you can see that.
Mm-hmm.
How
Yeah.
all of that is a very long intro to my question, which is,
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
you tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about how you feel that, and how you found that the Vietnam War affected and reflected in RPGs of the time?
Yeah. So, war is, of course, a big part of the DNA of D&D, flowing from tabletop war games, and then
Right.
also kind of a board game that a lot of people um, didn't realize, a game called Diplomacy.
Yes.
That was a very big game and thing. And if you go back, a gentleman by the name of John Peterson wrote a book called Playing at the World. And it is a very large book on the history, and it traces all the way back to chess, and it goes through a lot of board games and a lot of early games up to role-playing games, and then up to computer role-playing games. And it kind of talks in there a little bit about kind of these origins that the D&D flows from, right? And so we see that kind of aspect, and so we also see a lot of aspect where a lot of early adopters of D&D, they're right at that draft age, right? For Vietnam. As the game kind of starts to emerge, Vietnam is winding down,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of them are those who maybe served in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
or who were still thinking about the draft kind of being a reality for them, or they kind of just missed Vietnam, and so it's still kind of very much in their minds. And so I find a few things there when people are talking about the Vietnam War. For instance, there's a moment in one of these amateur press associations where one of the people sends in, of course, this exchange of ideas, this idea that they're going to have an encounter, and they had their group encounter a dragon, and the dragon's minions were Viet Cong.
Yeah.
And so again, this goes back to kind of this kind of reoccurring theme of taking kind of foreign peoples and things and kind of turning them into the villains, as of course the Viet Cong were going to be framed in that time frame, because again, the Vietnam War is very much on everyone's minds, right? So now they become kind of characters within D&D, just like that, right?
Yeah.
Now they're kind of the functional equivalent of goblins or kobolds or something like that, right? Serving this dragon as minions, and so it kind of puts them in that kind of same kind of thing. And so, and then you see a lot of commentary from throughout, from people playing games, people designing the games, about the Vietnam War and the impact it had on them, either from serving, and then how that's part of how they approach either the making of characters or the playing of these games. So just like these other things, it's something that's just so prevalent in the minds of people at that time, even as D&D kind of really starts to pick up after the Vietnam War. We are grappling with the Vietnam War, and we're going to flow into the late 70s and into the 80s with the trauma of the Vietnam War for America, because the Vietnam War is kind of, along with what was going on with all of these social movements, are kind of these kind of cracks in the plaster, right, of this story that what's known, what we call, one of my colleagues and many others reference the ethically constitutive story, the story that establishes what America is, why people behave the way they do in America, why things are the way they are, who's in charge, why they're in charge. And all of this has been challenged by these social movements and by Vietnam, and this idea that America is this great unbeatable state. And now we went into this place, and I mean, everybody's going to offer all kinds of apologetics. Well, we couldn't use our full force, and the politicians held us back, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we emerged from this thing with a sense of defeat, and everyone's grappling with that.
Yeah.
And that, I think, impacts kind of, once again, the shaping of these worlds, where now I can make a world where the people who are playing in the world can be the heroes. They can save the world. They can actually save the world from those threats, be it Vecna or be it that black dragon with the Viet Cong for minions. They can save the world. Yeah,
it's interesting that you say that, because looking back, and like I have a few lenses to look at my own, look back at history through, and some of them are clearer than others. Like, when you mention these things, what I'm thinking about very specifically are, like, you see Vietnam is not really on people's, wait, how can I phrase this? You don't see it in entertainment. Even, like, I think after Vietnam, you didn't see any movies or TV about it. You saw, like, MASH, for example, which is about the Korean War, but not about Vietnam. And then later on, I think in the 80s, you start to see, mostly, like, with a few exceptions, you see films like Rambo, where they go back and he's trying to deal and wrestle with it. And then, of course, there's a string of a lot of films where you see people that are really wrestling with the concept. With, I think Platoon is the one that's kind of like the high watermark of those films, but there's a lot of other ones in there, like Hamburger Hill or Casualties of War or things like that, where we're kind of wrestling on this sort of like level, this cultural level. And it would make a lot of sense what you're saying, like the idea of maybe young people or older people that are playing role-playing games and wrestling with these ideas through the games themselves, and sort of inserting these qualities on a very literal level, but I'm sure on an abstract level, like or figurative level as well. I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of actually
my mentor, who was my thesis advisor on this particular paper, she teaches a course on the Vietnam War through film. And certainly, yeah, what you were talking about, there's a little bit in the late, after Vietnam, immediately after Vietnam.
Oh, was okay.
Coming home, The Deer Hunter.
The Deer Hunter
is
yes.
There. MASH is about Vietnam, or
right?
About Korea, but it's really about Vietnam.
Vietnam, right? Yeah.
Because it's filmed in that kind of time frame after Vietnam, but they were afraid of dealing with Vietnam directly, so they didn't take it head on. But it's really about Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then, yes, the 80s, we really get into those things like First Blood, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and all of those other things. And even more so, I argue, for instance, that Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger is a Vietnam War film. They are in the jungle fighting an unseen enemy that is stalking and killing them. Everything about it. And the only way to defeat this enemy is now to kind of go back to kind of this natural kind of defenses and things like that is kind of playing the enemy's own game and things like that is the only way to defeat this enemy. So yeah, I argue that Predator is a Vietnam War film, even though it's not a Vietnam War film.
Right.
Because again, throughout that whole period, we're kind of wrestling, this ideal of America as this great democracy where everyone is equal and there aren't anybody who's really complaining, even though people have been complaining for a very long time. People say, oh, well, there's things, we have photographs of African Americans protesting Gone with the Wind when it premieres.
Yeah.
But we had constructed this idea that no, those things didn't happen, right? And so that was shattered in this time frame by Vietnam, by the civil rights movement, by second wave feminism. These ideas of kind of this idyllic, wonderful, unbeatable America are shattered, and people are grappling with that. So I'm arguing in part in the paper that by creating these worlds, that's how these kind of like mostly middle American male white writers are grappling with this, that they are grappling with these things, and they're kind of retreating into a shell a little bit of kind of this idyllic past, this romanticized vision of fictional versions of a past Europe, because they're all, whether we're talking Middle Earth, whether we're talking Conan, the world of Conan with Hyboria, whether we're talking any of the structures of what eventually will become the Forgotten Realms and things like that, they're all rooted in this, and so in the paper I put up all of these maps of these various places, and I say, okay, here's Europe, right? And then to the south, what do we have? We have kind of like an African analog.
Super interesting.
To the east, we're going to have our Asia analog. To the southeast, we're going to have kind of our Southeast Asia, our South Asian analogs, right? And then we're going to have kind of our analog of kind of like the quote unquote Middle East or the Levant or any of those regions there, right? A Southwest Asia, we're going to kind of put down there. And these maps, whether we're talking Forgotten Realms, whether we're talking Galarion from Pathfinder, whether we're talking any of these worlds, they all fit this structure. And I make it clear that like part of the reason to do this is it's easy, because it's easy to orient people in this towards a shortcut. You can say up here in the Northwest, guess what? Vikings, and you don't have to give a ton of explanation, right? And Howard even does it, plenty of problematic things, man. I read tons of Conan growing up, and I love playing with the world and kind of inverting and subverting some of the tropes of his style. But he does it specifically because he can create this world that is, Aquilonia is kind of like Gaul, right? It's very obviously Gaul. He calls the very far north Asgard. I mean, duh.
Right.
Right. Stygia is kind of this rough kind of fictional version of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And Katai to the east, and like all of these things, because he can now write in kind of this fictionalized version of the past without worrying of being accused of anachronisms. Yeah, exactly.
And
right.
You look at the map. I mean, there are the Black Kingdoms. There's some very like hitting you over the head.
The Pictish wilderness,
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and so he does it because he can now write in these areas that are essentially, basically, kind of, sort of Egypt,
Analogs
but
of,
he's not going to
yeah.
be accused of anachronisms, right? Of saying, oh well, the Egyptians didn't have that at that time frame. He can just write freely because now it's in this fictional world.
Right.
So it's an easy shorthand, but it also centers these Eurocentric worlds as the standard, and these other places become these kind of orientalized, fetishized, exotic places that are very kind of tropish in their design that we see. You can, if you were to have someone give them the descriptions of the kind of Asia or Africa or any of these other analogs from any of these worlds, they're going to craft kind of the exact same imagery time and time again.
Right.
And it's going to be usually, for the places that are outside of the Europe, usually going to be kind of problematic in the way it's presenting these other places.
Let me ask you this, because we focused on a lot of the issues, like the really, to me, the super interesting issues, the reflections on like things that are rather problematic or we're having difficulties with, or focused on in a way. You do, however, you end the paper on a really, to me, what's a very, very hopeful and like a very interesting idea. And you go back to that idea of encoding and re-encoding and going back and forth and all of that. How is it that like fan reactions, whether it be like the creations that they make or the feedback they give to the creators, or the way they interact with the imagery in the games and the way they change them to suit their own worlds, how do those new creations, and how do they help us like evolve and sort of change maybe problematic material, but also, I from a teaching standpoint, I believe that we change and we grow as individuals and like as a society. How are they helping us sort of step forward?
I think we're in kind of this unprecedented time, obviously globally, but particularly for role-playing games, even in their short lifespan, where, again, we had this very early period where it was, white male dominated for a very large chunk of time. There, again, were some other voices, but they were relatively rare for a very long time. And now we're in this place where we're seeing this phenomenal shift where fans are kind of sharing ideas, but even more so, fans are now able to help kind of boost and promote and put forward projects. And so we're seeing kind of this unprecedented time, which is so amazing. And I never would have even begun to imagine what we're seeing now, where we're seeing this kind of wide range of games that are coming out from marginalized creators in the LGBTQ community, in the Black and Indigenous and people of color communities, and in the disabled community, and in all of these other marginalized communities across the board, in so many different ways, are contributing these ideas and things. You had Connor Alexander, I know, on a little while ago with Coyote and Crow, and oh my gosh, man, I so thrilled to see that. So thrilled to see projects like Into the Motherlands,
yes,
and all of these other things that are coming out, that are coming from an African perspective, or that are coming from an indigenous perspective, or from an Asian perspective, and so many other things. It is just so gloriously amazing. And now we have this ability to interact on a much more direct level with the people who are creating these things and share ideas. And a lot of these places are kind of taking feedback from people and things like that. And there's this wonderful exchange of ideas. And certainly, as we've all seen, there's still a great amount of pushback of people who are like, oh, why do we need, they have all of these arguments about, wheelchairs and dungeons and all of these other things. And they are so caught up in this kind of appeal for tradition style argument against why do we need these changes. And they don't even stop to consider, let alone that, first off, it shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't matter in these fictional worlds with dragons and people throwing around spells and all these other things. None of that should matter. But even if we take it to the next level, there are in-game explanations as to why, like, say dwarves would use nothing but ramps instead of stairs in their city, right? Like, there are all of these other things that you could put in, but beyond that, it shouldn't matter for people to be able to see themselves reflected in these games, to have stories told from their perspectives, right? Like that. But I think some people are so caught up again in this tradition of what we've had so long of this kind of standard dominant narrative that they can't do exactly what you're talking about, putting themselves, kind of flipping those roles. There's a wonderful account on Twitter by a Kenyan journalist. His handle is @Gathara. And what he does is he will take news stories in America, and he will reframe those news stories using language, the way language is used to report on things in Africa. So, for instance, during January 6th, when January 6th happened, he puts up this tweet, and it's something to the effect of, in the virus-riddled United States, where hundreds of thousands have died, from the rampant COVID virus, insurrectionalists stormed the presidential palace.
Yes.
Yes. He takes these stories and he reframes them using this language, and it's amazing to watch so many people for the first time read these stories and go, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's a really eye-opening thing, and I feel like there's so, like, this is semi-related, not exactly related, but I feel like I've never had the perspectives in my life flipped so much as as when they were flipped when I lived overseas in Japan. And I think that going to Japan is maybe a softer way of seeing kind of the world. But for me, like, it was amazing. And again, this is probably going to sound very silly, but, I get onto a train and I look around and everybody's Japanese and I'm the only white person. And it makes me start thinking, like, okay, and then I'll go to a bank or something like that, and it's interesting. I would walk into a restaurant, and if I spoke Japanese, everybody would kind of stare at me, and then if I didn't speak Japanese, people would still stare at me, but then they'd talk about me too, or they'd sometimes talk about me even when I was talking Japanese, as if I weren't there,
right? Yeah.
And it's like I was saying, it's a very soft experience. But it caused me to start thinking about. I've never learned more about like being an American and being a white guy in America than when I was a white guy in Japan, and it made me really. I like to think that even though it was, like I said, it was like just the tip of the iceberg. I like to think I started to try my best to sort of excavate and go deeper and think harder about other perspectives. But I think that's a tough thing for a lot of Americans, to sort of figure out, and those the way, even like you said, these innocuous ways that we never think about things are phrased are actually not, and they're like anything but innocuous, and like when you reframe it like that, it's so enlightening.
It becomes stark.
Yes,
and I think that's you describe, I think, something that I really wish there were some way that everyone could experience, because I think not just visiting other cultures, but actually living in another culture where you're not. You're not the dominant figure there, right?
Yeah.
It completely can change your perspective and be like, oh wow, okay.
It was really interesting, and like I wish I had. It made me think to myself, I wish I'd lived in. I wish I had enough time in my life to live in 10 totally different countries besides Japan, and how many other things would I have learned? Like about being myself or dealing with people of different colors or languages or whatever. And it was just like, it's not fair that you can only live to maybe be 100 if you're in a healthy state. I should be able to live for 7 or 10 years in like 10 different nations and then return to America and use that knowledge to be an American for a while. And
I know that would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's not fair. I want more time, but
I hear you.
Is there someone? Is there like a you kind of mentioned this already, but I was wondering if there's someone in particular, like a creator or a writer or publisher right now that's like, you're like, oh my goodness, this person's stuff is so good. I got to get more of it, or it's so interesting, or.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many that I'm loving right now. Obviously, Coyote and Crow. I'm just so jazzed about that project, and everything that's going on there. I think I really dig what they're doing with the 2D20 system.
Yeah.
I think I really enjoy that. I'm really and there's just like, again, so many. Into the Motherlands is another one. I think there again to give these kind of like other perspectives that we just haven't seen before. I think globally and around the world. I think what is it called? Jiangxi, I think it is. Jiangxi. That's the blood or in the banquet hall. If I'm remembering the name correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, someone. But games like that, so many of them that I'm collecting and stacking up on the shelves that I haven't gotten to play yet.
Yeah, too many good
working
games.
my way through. I know, trying to get to them because, man, just this amazing explosion and so many things that I think, even if I'm not getting to play these games, when I talk about these ideas of re-encoding things, these games are, all of us have these moments of privilege, right? Where we are not part of a particular group and we don't, so we can never fully understand the struggles of that particular group. Even if for me, as if I study a particular group as a scholar, I can learn more than the lay person, but I'm not part of that group and I can't actually have those. But what I can do is I can get a little bit of that kind of reflection from their perspective, and I can think about thoughtful ways to incorporate some of these things like combat wheelchairs and other things into my game, to have characters who have characters in a wheelchair, or to have characters in things like that. That we just don't see. There's a project that I was fortunate enough to be asked to do a little bit of writing for that hopefully that should be premiering on Kickstarter here pretty soon. We've been sending out stuff about it. From Be Never Ending and Anansi's Tapestry of Lives. And they went to great lengths to get a wide, diverse range of creators from several different backgrounds. And the core, the main book is a book about, it's just NPCs. It's filled with NPCs.
Cool. Oh, wow.
That you can
That's
just
awesome.
kind of grab on a very quickly. And one of the things that they're hoping to do with it as part of the Kickstarter is to have there's art for every single one of the NPCs. It gives you a little bit of background on the NPCs, some story hooks with the NPCs, and all of these other details.
Oh, that's cool.
So you can just pull an NPC very quickly, and they're very kind of openly generic, whether they are just a professor or an archaeologist or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they have they're going to have the characters hopefully voiced on an app.
Oh,
where you can have
cool
voicings of these characters and everything like that.
Get a feel for.
And they went really out of their way, and great praise to them because they got a wide diverse. So there are characters in there who are disabled. There are LGBTQ characters. There are characters of color. There are characters who are adopted. There are characters who have all of this wide range array of traits and things like that. And so I think like that plays into this idea where even if we're not necessarily able to like get around, like you said, I wish we had more time to play all of these various games. We can learn from them, and we can take ideas from them, because that's one of the great traits of role-playing games, is that, you know, in your home you can kind of kit bash and pull things apart. And that's where I think the strength comes from of kind of like changing the style of what role-playing games are, is that we can kind of now interconnect and share these ideas. So I can take some ideas and some things that I learned from these other games and inject some of these characters who have some of these other identities and some of these other traits into my games, more so than I would have in the past.
Yes.
And do it in a thoughtful, meaningful way, rather than just kind of some performative, oh, I need to have a character.
Right.
I need to have an Asian character, I'm just going to throw one in, right? We can do this in some very meaningful, thoughtful ways by learning from these other games and from pulling from these other sources, and then sharing that out, right? We can share those things through social media, through other things, where now other people can say, oh, you know what? I can take that and maybe just do this with it, and that's going to fit perfectly in this game. So
that's a wonderful thing. Like, really, like, it's funny, like, this is a very generic kind of thing that I've wrestled with through my life. Like, for years as a game master, I've always tried to like homebrew everything, and I'm like, I don't want to use like other people's material. I don't want to know. But when I started using other people's material, what I found is that my games got richer, and I feel like I sort of not trained myself, but I helped myself kind of like expand my own ways of thinking, and I made my games more interesting because, you know, I would just steal it. I would find like really cool stuff in other people's like games, and like you just steal slices. The idea of having like a codex of NPCs, all from like various walks of life and backgrounds, and representing like different cultures and societies and all that, just would be. I try my best to make my games as like kind of like, when I say like interesting, and to me interesting is like when they represent like real people, and it sounds like a wonderful way to kind of inject that. Let me ask you as maybe a final question here. What lies in the future for you, Stefan? What's up? What's next? You're gonna be continue to teach? Do you think?
Yeah. I'm definitely gonna continue to teach. And I think for me right now, I think the biggest thing is right now I'm kind of like one among a kind of a new crop of historians, I would say, and not just historians, but I think in a lot of other disciplines, who are coming to the realization that for a very long time, academia has had this very kind of ivory tower problem. We have put some very vital information behind paywalls, kept them in the classroom, and done things in a particular way where that information is not getting shared out. And that has become super problematic in the particular area when we're talking about false narratives of history, when we're talking about false narratives of science and the way vaccines work or the way masking works and all these other things. You know, we do a very rotten job in this society of teaching people how vaccines work and the efficacy of vaccines. And part of that, again, you know, one of the things I tout in my classes is that in the absence, we have tons of data to demonstrate that in the absence of information to the contrary, people take what they see in media, in films and in television shows, to be the way things work in the actual world. So one of the great examples is if you're watching a movie, vaccines work 100% of the time. They get a vaccine, that virus or whatever that's killed a million people, and that's the other thing. Viruses, major viruses in the thing, we're talking about stacking bodies like cordwood in the streets, right? It's so deadly, you know, 90% death rate. The streets are empty, right? People are wandering around in a wasteland. But when we get a vaccine, fixed, right? Yeah. And that's the way people think. I was sitting in a restaurant right in the middle of COVID, and I heard somebody say, well, the COVID vaccine isn't really a vaccine. It's more like the flu shot. And that to me is a clear indicator of we do a rotten job of describing, one, what vaccines work like. We do a rotten job of describing what the scientific method actually is. People say, scientists don't know what they're talking about. They're changing their stories all the time. Well, no, data changes. We get new data and it changes things, right? As we acquire new data, it changes things in the field. And this is true in science. It's true in things, but we've kept all of these things. We've done a rotten job of teaching them in K through 12. And then we've kept so many key things behind paywalls. And then what we get are these false narratives of new study says, and then they go on to misinterpret the new study. And so for me, and some of my colleagues, we're starting to try and shift that narrative and move more into the area of no, we can't sit behind up in the ivory tower anymore. We have to share these ideas out in meaningful, thoughtful ways. As much as we can do that, it's tough on social media, obviously, in the limited form of Twitter. But we try as much as possible to kind of share these ideas of nuance and share these things out. And that's part of what I'm trying to do on Twitter. And I hope to continue to kind of do that and kind of expand that even more, and have more conversations, open conversations with some of my more academically minded colleagues, people like you who want to approach things from a more academic mindset and kind of share these things out in a thoughtful way to kind of counter the, and it's like a Sisyphean task, because we're fighting this algorithm that wants people to be attracted to these polarized stories, so they're going to doom scroll and they're going to stay on and see more advertisements and things like that, and not be able to understand so much of the pushback, like for instance against my paper and things like that. So much of the pushback comes from people who don't understand the nuance. They don't understand the subtleties of the argument. They're like, well, you don't have any direct evidence, or well, you know, we've always done things like this, or all of these like things that are couched in a number of logical fallacies, from the all or nothing fallacy to the appeal to tradition fallacy to the appeal to extremes fallacy, because people are just arguing from kind of this raw emotional set of polarized ideas. And I'm trying to do what little I can to combat that. And that's where I hope to continue to teach and kind of do that in the classroom, but also do that kind of in the public sphere, and hopefully kind of chip away at things that are, I think, you know, obviously with COVID and January 6th and all of these other things that are obviously damaging us as a whole.
Yeah. Well, Stefan, that is, I can't think of a better way to close off the night. Just all of those things as a teacher myself really ring true with me as well. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on my program. I do appreciate it. And as my viewers know, I try to get people on here that I think are interesting, have something very worthwhile to say, have a real fresh perspective and a positive attitude. And if you can, I highly recommend that you check out Stefan's Twitter feed. It's just it's a goldmine of really wonderful, thoughtful content in an otherwise very very dismal, dark, addictive, sometimes not very much fun platform. It will brighten your day. It's the sort of stuff that will enlighten you and brighten your day. I also recommend, if you have a chance, to take a look at and read through his paper as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk to him afterwards, and I'll see if he will allow me to maybe share it in the links and in the description above.
Feel free.
Oh, well, there you go.
Go ahead.
There's our answer. So I'll be sure. His Twitter feed is in the description, and probably by tomorrow morning I'll try and get his a link to his paper in the description as well. And for those of you that have been watching or listening tonight, again, I want to thank you very much for your support, and for your viewership. I really do very much appreciate it, and I meant what I said about like the channel, for me, relatively speaking, has been exploding. I see people in the chat. Neoseth, I see you. Steve, I see you. Thank you very much for taking the time. to talk with each other. I think that that's something that's very important and often overlooked in a classroom. As everybody listens to the teachers, they don't often listen as much as they should to each other. So thank you for doing that. So if you're interested in more stuff from my channel, please do hit the subscribe button and think about sharing. That share button also helps me out tremendously. If everybody shared this one time, if every viewer shared this one time that I have, every subscriber, I'd have twice as many subscribers. If you share it twice, I'll have 3 times as much. So if you do that, that's very helpful. You can also follow me and the channel and all of the other folks that come on our Discord, our Facebook page, or our Twitter feed. And I do have to warn you, the Twitter feed has got a lot of cats. A lot of my cat in it. So I hope you can sort of put up with that. And we will be back in a couple weeks on August 29th. That's a Monday. We're going to have Harley Kane. She is a performer, a cosplayer, and a tabletop enthusiast. And we're going to talk about sort of making some of the fantasy become a reality through actually dressing up and sort of enacting out those things that we all have fun thinking about in our minds. So at any rate, thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful ride. I appreciate all of you being here, and we will be back with another episode of Roleplayer with 1,000 Faces, and there will certainly be, you can watch the channel for actual plays and Game Masters in the Machine, and a few other little surprises as well. So thank you all very much. Everybody stay safe out there. Stay positive and have a really great game.